Generally yields back. Now recognize Mr. Feenstra for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Thompson, and thank you, witnesses, for being here today. You know, this is a topic that we really need to address, and I'm so grateful that you're here. I want to play off Dr. Baird and what he said when it comes to intellectual property and what's going on. You know, and I'm from Iowa, probably the district that has the most corn and soybeans growing anywhere in the nation. Our land sells for about $30,000 an acre, or at least it did about several miles from my house a couple months ago. One shocking story from my state, and Representative Gallagher noted this, that a person was spotted in a field in Iowa digging up hybrid corn seeds, and was eventually found out that they were sending these corn seeds back to China. This PRC national was later arrested and admitted that he was involved in a long conspiracy to steal trade secrets from our two major U.S. seed companies. And you think about it can cost nearly $100 million to have these new hybrids come about. I mean, it takes time and years and all this stuff, and here they're trying to steal them. Mr. Gackel, can you talk about, obviously we know the dangers, right? We know China poses this risk, but how can we, and it's so difficult, how can we prevent some of this IP theft?
Well, it's as the group has been discussing today, and those of us amongst the table, I think there's quite a bit of unanimity here on some of those steps that can be taken. American Soybean Association, and I personally as a farmer, recognize how complex and difficult these issues are, but you're correct, the solutions are hard to find. I think it's, I gave an example of public-private partnership when it came into investing in new markets. I think it could be similar on this side of issues as well when it comes to data protection and IP, and other actions that are viewed negatively from China. You know, how can the public sector and the private sector, whether it's seed companies, universities, government, find ways to address those complex issues and bring some solutions forward that, I mean, for me as a farmer, it does me no good either for those situations to be possible or occur. So looking for solutions from our side as growers as well.
I agree, Mr. Gackel. I mean, it's a partnership, private-public, from our universities to our companies, you name it. But it's very worrisome to see what's happening. And could you expound on that, Mr. Daly, just a little bit? I mean, what are trends that you're seeing in this area?
So expounding on it a little bit, I think what's informative is some of the service I had. I remember when I was at the National Security Council and dealing with trade matters, and we'd get intelligence that would come from our intelligence agencies on trade issues that were going on with our counterparts, and it was really lacking. They just didn't have the experience. The intelligence agencies didn't have the experience to be able to go in and focus on that kind of intelligence. So obviously it was mixed with defense and other matters. So I think over time they got good at it. So I think it's a matter of applying, as you've done here, with a focus on it.
That's right.
For our intelligence folks, whether that's at Justice, FBI, or NSA, focusing that resource on what is needed here to address these IP thefts and guard against the taking that's happening.
I agree. I want to pivot just a little bit to you, Ambassador Tom. In my district, we grow a lot of corn and we have a lot of pork. And when China has 6% of the pork and beef markets, and then a tremendous amount of our soybeans go and our corn, you name it, this becomes a bit of a problem. You mentioned Africa a while ago, that we got to diversify. We all understand we have to diversify. Our biggest problem with going into Africa is the infrastructure, supply chain infrastructure. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? I mean, I think of our dairy, I think of our pork industry, our cattle industry. You need refrigeration if we're going to go into Africa and other countries. And as you noted, that it's really their next step on that food chain of what they want to buy. Can you talk just a little bit about that, Ambassador, of what are the obstacles of us getting into some of these countries?
Yeah, first I'll start out by saying that, your point about the livestock and the amount of exports that we have, whether it's beef, pork, or poultry, mainly pork and beef, though, that's going into China. We've seen exponential growth in those two areas. And I mean, the U.S. producers benefited from that and continues to benefit from that. But again, they're trying to replace us on the pork side at least. When I look at Africa, I look at infrastructure, yeah, it's very lacking. There is no cold supply chain.
Nope.
We've seen very little investment in many countries across Africa. You know, I was just in Sudan, as I said, about a year ago. They're building some toll roads, private companies are, and everything else. But the reality is, once you get into the interior of the country, whether it's there, Tanzania, Niger, Burkina Faso, there is no infrastructure.
No, exactly right.
There is no infrastructure, and this is where, you know, what we were supposed to be doing at the Food and Agriculture Organization is creating resilience and capacity in food systems, but it hasn't happened.
No, and I just want to quick note this. I got a Fridge Act that sort of goes down this path that we can use some of these dollars from the different export things that we have, FMD and so forth. But with that, I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now, please recognize the gentlelady from Oregon, Mrs. Salinas, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the panelists for being here today. As we think about the impact of China on the competitiveness of U.S. farmers, I think it's also important that we remember that our nation's agricultural economy doesn't really stop just in our fields. In fact, our nation's food and beverage industry is among America's largest domestic manufacturing sectors, and that includes food processing and canned food staples that millions of Americans rely on every day. I'm proud that my home state of Oregon plays an important role in this industry, being a critical supplier of canned fruits in particular. This industry definitely sees the impact of China as well. The China Canned Food Industry Association proudly touts record-breaking growth for Chinese exports to the United States, threatening thousands of U.S. food manufacturing jobs and economic activity in states all across the country, obviously including Oregon. Further, consumers may not even be aware that canned goods they're purchasing are produced in China. In some instances, American-grown canned goods are mixed in with Chinese-grown products and sold under the same label, making it difficult for consumers to know what and the sources of their purchases. And this question is for the whole panel. What policy steps would you suggest to bolster U.S. farmers, reward manufacturers who rely on American-grown and processed ingredients, and ensure consumers know where the food they eat is actually grown?
Well, we know there's always been a lot of country of origin labeling that's taken place to really understand, but we're not going to say that the Chinese play by fair rules. Let's face it, it doesn't happen. In terms of some of the food processing, yeah, I understand your concerns. I was recently in Alaska, spoke at a conference up there, and the amount of fish that is being shipped out of Alaska for further processing in China and then back to the United States is substantial. And you ask yourself, why can't we do it here at home? What is the headwind that's stopping us from doing that? So whether it's fish, whether it's soybeans, whether it's some other protein product, we need to figure out how we can create the value-add opportunities here at home, creating the jobs for the U.S. citizens.
Thank you. Mr. Daly?
Yeah, I absolutely concur with what the ambassador had to say here. Obviously, labeling issues, tracking exports, tracking imports of what China is doing, and putting a focus on that. Obviously, there's resources at the Department of Commerce and USTR to be able to identify these issues and work with the Department of Agriculture to make sure we are ensuring that China is not cheating on this matter and that we can build resources to produce it here.
Thank you. Mr. Gackel, did you have anything to add?
Yes, thank you. Just briefly, and very good question. I'll maybe give a specific example of back home in North Dakota and talk about value added and soybean, U.S. soy, American Soybean Association, working very hard on finding new domestic uses for what we grow, knowing that, as was mentioned earlier, we're not going to stop growing soybeans, and we're getting more efficient and better at growing a big crop. So finding those new uses and new demand in North Dakota, we have one new soybean crush plant that's come online. So there's opportunity there for the oil and the renewable diesel. But a side product of that, and not a small side product, a big byproduct of that is the new meal opportunities that we're going to have. And when Ambassador Tom talks about value added and those types of opportunities with the new meal that may be available through additional crush plants throughout the country, I think just a great opportunity there to add value to our domestic ag value chain.
Thank you. So obviously, China is notorious for its violations of international labor standards, including in the ag sector. For instance, in 2021, the U.S. banned imports of cotton and tomatoes produced in the Xinjiang province due to strong evidence of forced labor practices. Beyond their labor practices, China, as we've heard today, also engages in IP theft, cyber attacks in order to steal data, and have increased their ownership of foreign agricultural land, including here in the U.S. However, as a member of the Congressional Executive Committee on China, I'm focused on both calling out and combating China's bad behavior, while also acknowledging that our trade relationship is critical to the American economy, particularly the ag sector. In 2022, for instance, Oregon exported over $300 million of agricultural products to China. I also consistently hear from constituents about the importance of the market access and foreign market development programs, and the importance of exports to our overall ag economy cannot be understated. So again, for the whole panel, we as members of Congress think about our trade relationship with China. How can we balance the hard economic realities that our constituents face while also combating the Chinese government's egregious behavior?
I see time is running short, but quickly, I would just, the more, if there's targeted ways to address those situations to try and diminish the negative ramifications that come back on U.S. producers, I don't have any exact recommendations on what those would be, but maybe just a bit more strategic when it comes to the policies trying to approach those certainly important and real concerns about the situation in certain places in China, but targeted and more strategic, but I'm sure others have better detail on that.
Thank you.
Yeah, quickly, strategic surgical actions in trade relations. Obviously, sometimes when you go with big actions, you have big responses, but if you do them surgically, according to U.S. laws or building out on the right laws, it's understandable by the counterpart, and usually you don't have a big splash.
The only thing I'll add is, it's just been a few years ago that China had, or we had a trade imbalance of China. They had over $500 billion worth of sales to the United States, and we only had $350 billion to China. We've got to find a way to figure that out, how we can increase our sales to China or find other sources for some of the products we're buying from China today. We've got to balance it.
That's right. Thank you all. I yield back.
Gentlelady's time expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Alford, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. Really appreciate that. I don't have to tell you that China has its tentacles in everything we do. They are poisoning the minds of our young people with TikTok. They're poisoning their bodies, wiping out almost an entire generation of young people, killing 100,000 of our fellow citizens each year through fentanyl. I also sit on the House Armed Services Committee, and I represent two very distinguished bases, including Fort Leonard Wood, but also Whiteman Air Force Base, home of the B-2 stealth bomber and soon to be home of the B-21. We're concentrating on being an effective deterrent against the CCP and the PLA. You know, there are some generals who are openly saying that we could be at war with China by 2027. That's 3 years. We're trying to get ready for any potential conflict. I believe that we have to do everything we can to keep our country safe from China's influence and espionage, and agriculture is a critical part of the conversation. Our food security is national security. We have to be prepared for what could be coming. You know, in 2022, it was the last report shown China owned 383,935,000 acres in the United States of America, and yet you cannot go there and buy land. Recently, we introduced the American Land and Property Protection Act to protect Americans and our land from ownership by foreign adversary nations, including China, Iran, Russia, Venezuela, North Korea, Cuba. They shouldn't even be able to buy an outhouse in the United States of America, as far as I'm concerned. So, Mr. Daley, why is it important that we protect our property here in America from the Chinese Communist Party that wants to replace us as a world power?
Thank you, Mr. Congressman. An excellent question. It's a point of the spear question in terms of what we're dealing and having to address in terms of the Chinese Communist Party and how they've effectuated laws, recent laws over the last couple years that have effectively weaponized private companies, private Chinese companies, and put their private citizens under obligations to report and do what the state wants. So that becomes the issue. before this committee and you as leaders of this country. What should we allow, given that China has pretty much put in place a system and laws that make and weaponize their companies and put their individual citizens in a position they have to do what the state asks them to do?
Well, I think it's time to circle the wagons. Look, we can halfway do this. Our governor had an executive order last year prohibiting any land sales within 10 miles of a military base. I mean, that's a good start, but I'm the firm belief Chinese communists should not be able to buy property in America. Case closed. And it may hurt us on trade. I know, sir, Ambassador, you just mentioned that we need to increase our trade with China. This may hurt our trade, but we've got to protect America. Mr. Gackle, what contingency plans, say we are at war with China over Taiwan in the next 4 to 5 years, what contingency plan do producers have, soybean producers have, to protect the investments in our producers here in America?
Thank you for the question, Congressman, and provided some highlights earlier in oral and written testimony. We learned from the 2018 tariffs and retaliatory actions from China just how much that type of situation can affect our bottom line on the farm. And as I've mentioned before, looking to diversify and grow new markets, understanding that there are risks there when you rely so heavily on one particular market or country. The scale of China being so large makes that risk even greater, and so I think that's why you're seeing more farmer dollars invested in finding these new markets, finding new exports, and as I talked about, another contingency is just more domestic demand and more domestic uses for what we are growing here. But again, we may continue to outproduce that demand even if we find new on-takers for renewable diesel or the meal that I talked about. So we're going to have to grow. We're going to have to do both.
Well, I just want to close. I appreciate you being here. This is a very serious matter, and I think most Americans are asleep when it comes to the threat from Communist China. And I'm here to tell you now, the big bad wolf is at the door, and we better make sure that our house is made of brick and not straw. It's going to get blown in, and it's not going to be a pretty picture. Thank you so much for being here, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now please recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Davis, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and to the witnesses who are here today. Thank you so much for being with us today. As other members have highlighted today, agriculture is a very trade-dependent industry, and China is a top trading partner. How would you prioritize the most practical safeguards that can be put into place that will allow the U.S. agriculture community to export to China and not have markets and prices manipulated by their government or trade wars causing farmers to be the ones bearing the brunt of decisions? Just trying to prioritize.
Yeah, when I think about, you're from the state of North Carolina, a major pork producer.
That's right.
I think whether it's pork or whether it's beef or whether it's the grains we produce on our farms back in the Midwest, there is no doubt we know our government conducts war games to understand what happens when China inevitably takes back Taiwan. We need to do the same as producers, as an industry, to make sure, how do we react? How do we prepare before this actually happens? Because it's going to happen. He's made comments that it's going to happen. So let's prepare now. Let's not wait for it. In terms of prioritization, again, we have to continue to grow our sales around the world, diversify, continue to sell to China. But again, I think it's time we balance that trade out.
Yeah, I agree with the ambassador. There's already a number of companies, major U.S. companies, that are consulting with experts and technicians to understand what the ramifications are if we have a hot war issue with China in terms of their processes of sales globally, in terms of how their supply chains deal with it as well. So I think companies are going that way, and I think the government needs itself in the ag space to really focus in on this. And I think members here today and yourself have made this a big focus in terms of what should be the priorities. And I think this is an exercise where the Ag Department has to work with industry and you all to make sure those priorities are in line with with U.S. national and economic security and food security.
Super.
Maybe to touch on something just a little separate, but in line with those things. So looking at profitability for farmers and what we're trying to manage as risk, I think a priority area and something we haven't talked about much is just sending or getting the policy right in D.C., whether it's here in Congress or through the administration, on incentives for further domestic growth, incentives for sustainable aviation fuel. That's one idea we haven't talked much about, but getting that policy right as it's getting developed and trying to get off the ground could be a potentially huge market there for U.S. producers. And then maybe in the regulatory as well, trying to find ways to ease the regulatory burden on producers, streamlining whether it's EPA issues or other or federal agencies when it comes to regulatory types of issues. But getting that policy right as well provides a little more predictability and certainty for U.S. producers.
Okay, thank you. U.S. agriculture is the cream of the crop when it comes to productivity, innovation, and producing agriculture further ahead into the 21st century using new technology. China is not only interested in these innovations, but in the past, operatives have been caught trying to smuggle them out of the country. My question here, is there any way to evaluate or ensure that our investments in emerging agriculture technology are not being exploited by China for their own advantage?
Thank you, Congressman. That's a great question, and it's right on the forefront. We have to be vigilant in terms of having our intelligence agencies work with the Department of Agriculture to give and provide that intelligence information that's going to be able to spot, identify where the threat's going to emanate, and be able to capture it before it occurs. So that's a big part of this equation. The second part of this equation is, I think, making sure we get our cybersecurity systems in line with the agricultural producers. That means making sure we get a wrap on the technologies that are out there, Internet of Things technologies that China is controlling the market on. We need to make sure we friend-shore that or produce it here in the United States.
You know, a nation's power is usually predicated upon 4 key pillars. One is diplomatic presence around the world to get involved in any other country that we need to be involved with before a crisis happens. 2 is economic, 3 is military, but 4th is informational. And I think we need to make sure that we're tapping in and collaborating across agencies, USDA, CIA, FBI, everybody, that we're having the best information to make sure we understand what's going on and what China's doing behind the scenes that we're not monitoring today. You know, it's one thing as an agriculture industry, we tend to trust everybody. Farmers are the best at helping somebody when their barn blows down. They go together and they don't worry about getting any financial support to do that. They go together and work. We trust people. We do things together. But I think we've let our guard down in guarding our intellectual property. Now it's got to come up, and we need any support we can get from you. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. It sounds easy. We'll have a lot of work ahead of us. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. We yield back.